Kenneth Smith, the first nitrogen gas execution. Kenneth Eugene Smith had 22 minutes to live, and two different groups of people watched him die. Same room, same execution. But the state said he lost consciousness in 2 minutes and died peacefully. The journalists in the witness room said he writhed and gasped for at least 7 minutes, maybe longer. His spiritual advisor, standing right next to him, said what he witnessed was the most horrible thing he'd ever seen. Someone is lying. And here's why that matters. This was the first time in American history anyone was executed this way. No protocols. No previous cases. No way to know what normal looks like. So when Alabama said he died peacefully, and witnesses said he suffered horribly, there's no record to prove who's telling the truth. January 25, 2024. Kenneth Smith became the first human being executed by breathing pure nitrogen gas. The method veterinarians refused to use on animals. The method the United Nations warned could be torture. The method no country had ever dared try. And Smith had already survived one execution attempt. 15 months earlier, prison staff spent over an hour stabbing needles into his arms, his hands, his legs, desperately trying to establish an 4-line before their midnight deadline. They failed. He walked out of that execution chamber alive. So Alabama tried again. With an experimental method. No witnesses could agree on what they saw. And here's the question that should terrify you. If the state will lie about how someone died during an execution, or even just sees what they want to see, what else are they lying about? Because Kenneth Smith was sentenced to death by a judge. Not a jury. 2 separate juries recommended life in prison. 7 jurors said, "Don't execute him." 11 jurors said, "Don't execute him." The judges overruled them both. That practice was so problematic Alabama banned it in 2017. But Smith? He stayed on death row. Here's what we know for certain. Kenneth Smith was guilty of a horrific murder in 1988. A church pastor's wife, killed in her own home for insurance money. That's not in dispute. But here's what keeps me up at night. 2 juries said life in prison. He spent 34 years on death row. He survived 1 execution. Then they used an untested method on him, and the state and the witnesses can't even agree on whether he suffered or not. So the question isn't just, did Kenneth Smith deserve to die? The question is, in a system where judges override juries, where execution attempts fail, where they experiment with new methods, and where officials can't even agree on what happened in the execution chamber, can we trust this system with the power to kill? By the end of this video, you'll know what really happened in that execution chamber. You'll hear from all sides, the victim's family who waited 35 years for justice, the witnesses who can't forget what they saw, and the legal experts who warned this would happen. And you'll have to decide for yourself, was this justice, or was this something else entirely? But to understand how we got here, we need to go back 36 years. Back to a small Alabama town. Back to a pastor with money problems and a deadly solution. Back to a murder for hire that cost $3,000 and changed American history. Subscribe now, because what happened to Kenneth Smith could reshape capital punishment in America. And the cases I cover next will show you exactly how broken this system really is. In 1988, Elizabeth Sennett was 45 years old, living in Colbert County in northwest Alabama. She was married to Charles Sennett Sr., a local pastor who led the West Side Church of Christ. To their community, they seemed like a respectable couple. Charles was a preacher. Elizabeth sang in the church choir. But their marriage was crumbling, and Charles Sennett had a problem. He was deeply in debt, having made poor financial decisions that left him owing significant sums of money. He wanted out of the marriage, but divorce would leave him in an even worse financial position. Then Charles Sennett made a calculation that would destroy multiple lives. His wife was worth more to him dead than alive. She had a life insurance policy. According to court documents, Charles Sennett began asking around about hiring someone to kill his wife. He eventually connected with a man named Billy Gray Williams, who in turn recruited 2 other men, Kenneth Eugene Smith and John Forrest Parker. The 3 men agreed to murder Elizabeth Sennett for $1,000 each, $3,000 total. Think about that for a moment. A woman's life, valued at $3,000. split three ways. On March 18, 1988, while Charles Sennett made sure he had an alibi, the three men entered the Sennett home. What happened next was brutal. Elizabeth Sennett was attacked in her own house, stabbed multiple times, and beaten. The killers tried to stage the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. Then they left her to die. When Charles Sennett discovered his wife's body and called police, investigators initially treated it as a home invasion. But the staging was sloppy. Evidence didn't add up. Little did anyone know, the investigation that would follow would eventually expose the murder-for-hire plot, but not before Charles Sennett made one final choice that would leave his son without both parents. Within days of Elizabeth Sennett's murder, police began focusing on Charles Sennett. The staged crime scene raised immediate red flags. Financial records revealed his money troubles. When detectives started asking harder questions, the pastor's story began to crack. On March 21, 1988, just 3 days after his wife's murder, Charles Sennett Sr. drove to a remote area and took his own life. He left no confession, no note explaining his role in Elizabeth's death. But his suicide told investigators everything they needed to know. An innocent man doesn't kill himself 3 days after his wife is murdered. Now police had to work backwards. If Charles Sennett orchestrated his wife's murder, who did he hire? The investigation led them to Billy Gray Williams, who eventually cooperated with authorities. Williams implicated both Kenneth Smith and John Parker. All three men were arrested and charged with capital murder committed during a robbery, a crime eligible for the death penalty in Alabama. The trials that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Prosecutors presented evidence that Charles Sennett had actively sought out hired killers, that he'd paid $3,000 to have his wife murdered so he could collect her life insurance money. The three men who carried out the killing were convicted. But here's where the story takes a turn that would prove crucial decades later. The juries in these cases couldn't agree on sentencing. Kenneth Smith was tried twice. In the first trial in 1989, the jury voted 11-1 for life imprisonment without parole. A mistrial was declared on sentencing. In his second trial in 1996, the jury voted 7-5 in favor of life imprisonment. 7 jurors believed Smith should spend the rest of his life in prison but should not be executed. Under Alabama law at the time, the jury's vote was advisory. The final decision belonged to the judge. Despite the jury's recommendation for life, the judge overrode that recommendation and sentenced Kenneth Smith to death. John Parker's jury also recommended life by a vote of 7-5. His judge also overrode that recommendation and imposed a death sentence. This practice, judicial override, would become a central controversy in Kenneth Smith's case. Alabama was one of only 3 states that allowed judges to override jury sentencing recommendations in capital cases. In 2017, Alabama finally abolished the practice. But the law wasn't retroactive. Smith and Parker remained on death row, sentenced to die by judges who had rejected their jury's recommendations for life. Think about that. 18 jurors across 2 trials said Kenneth Smith shouldn't be executed. 2 judges said he should. Guess who won? Kenneth Eugene Smith arrived at Alabama's Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore to begin his wait on death row. He would spend 34 years there, watching other prisoners be executed while his own appeals wound through the courts. Life on death row is a peculiar kind of existence. Inmates spend 22 to 23 hours per day in their cells. They're isolated from the general prison population. Every day is essentially the same as the one before, an endless, unchanging routine punctuated only by court dates, visits from lawyers, and the knowledge that the state is actively trying to end your life. According to records and interviews, Smith maintained his guilt in Elizabeth Sennett's murder but argued against the death penalty in his case. His legal team raised multiple arguments over the years. The judicial override that sentenced him to death despite a jury recommendation for life, questions about whether the murder was actually committed during a robbery, which would make it non-capital murder, and concerns about the proportionality of his sentence compared to the other participants. Billy Gray Williams, who cooperated with authorities and testified against Smith and Parker, received a life sentence and became eligible for parole. Charles Sennett Jr., the victim's son, has spoken publicly about the lasting trauma of losing his mother in such a violent way and then losing his father to suicide days later. The question that haunted the case for decades was whether executing the hired killers would bring any measure of peace to a family destroyed by one man's greed and violence. By 2022, Kenneth Smith had been on death row longer than Elizabeth Sennett had been alive when she was killed. John Parker had been executed by lethal injection in 2010. Now, 34 years after the crime, Alabama scheduled Kenneth Smith's execution for November 17, 2022. What happened that night would set in motion a chain of events leading to an unprecedented experiment in American capital punishment. But what Smith experienced that night would also raise a question that still hasn't been answered. At what point does trying to execute someone become torture? November 17, 2022. Kenneth Eugene Smith was transported from his death row cell to the execution chamber at Holman Correctional Facility. Alabama was preparing to execute him by lethal injection, the state's standard method of execution for decades. The execution was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m. The state had until midnight to carry out the sentence before the death warrant expired. Prison staff began the process of establishing intravenous lines in Smith's arms so the lethal drugs could be administered. Then everything went wrong. According to court filings and witness accounts, prison staff spent over an hour trying to establish for access. They stuck needles into Smith's arms repeatedly. When they couldn't find suitable veins in his arms, they moved to his hands. Then his legs. Smith would later testify in court that he was poked and prodded over a dozen times. He said he was in excruciating pain. He said he prayed they would just get it over with. Imagine that. Praying for your own execution to proceed because the alternative, hours of needle sticks, was worse. But the execution team couldn't establish a reliable foreline. The clock was ticking. Midnight was approaching, and once the death warrant expired, they would legally have to stop. At approximately 11:21 p.m., just 39 minutes before the deadline, Alabama's Department of Corrections called off the execution. Kenneth Smith was unstrapped from the gurney and returned to his cell. He had survived his own execution. This wasn't the first botched execution attempt in Alabama's recent history. In September 2022, just 2 months before Smith's failed execution, the state had also failed to execute Alan Miller by lethal injection before his death warrant expired. Something was seriously wrong with Alabama's execution protocol. The American Civil Liberties Union and other advocacy groups called for a moratorium on executions in Alabama pending a full investigation. But the state had a different response. If lethal injection wasn't working reliably, they would try a different method. Alabama had already authorized nitrogen hypoxia as an alternative execution method back in 2018, though it had never been used. Now, prison officials began developing a protocol to execute Kenneth Smith using a method never before attempted in the United States or anywhere else in the world. They were going to make him the first, a guinea pig, a test subject. And the question no one could answer was, what would happen when they put that mask on his face and turned on the gas? Nitrogen hypoxia execution works on a simple principle: replace the oxygen someone breathes with pure nitrogen gas. Since nitrogen makes up roughly 78% of the air we normally breathe and is non-toxic, the theory is that a person breathing pure nitrogen would simply fall unconscious from lack of oxygen and die peacefully, without the pain or awareness of suffocating. At least, that was the theory. When Alabama announced its intention to execute Kenneth Smith using nitrogen hypoxia, the decision sparked immediate controversy. Medical experts, human rights organizations, and even some death penalty supporters raised serious concerns. No state or country had ever executed someone using this method. There were no long-term studies on its effects. No protocols had been tested. Alabama would essentially be experimenting on a human being. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights called the planned execution particularly concerning. A group of experts warned it could amount to torture. Veterinarians pointed out that using nitrogen hypoxia to euthanize animals is banned in many places because it's considered inhumane. But proponents argued nitrogen hypoxia would be more humane than lethal injection, which has been plagued by botched executions, drug shortages, and allegations of causing severe pain. They pointed to cases where people exposed to nitrogen in industrial accidents reported feeling lightheaded and then losing consciousness without awareness of suffocation. They said it would be quick and painless. Kenneth Smith's legal team fought the execution method vigorously. They argued it violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. They argued the state couldn't use an untested experimental method. They argued that Smith had already been subjected to one failed execution attempt and shouldn't have to go through another. Court after court rejected these arguments. The Alabama Supreme Court, federal district courts, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and finally the United States Supreme Court all declined to halt the execution. The legal reasoning generally held that while the method was novel, Smith hadn't proven it would cause unnecessary suffering, and states have broad latitude in choosing execution methods. The execution was scheduled for January 25, 2024. Alabama developed a protocol involving a commercial-grade respirator-type mask fitted tightly over Smith's face. Pure nitrogen would flow into the mask while his exhaled breath would be vented out. According to the state's own predictions, Smith would lose consciousness within seconds and die within minutes. The night of the execution, media witnesses, including reporters from major news organizations, were brought into the viewing room. Elizabeth Sennett's family members were also present. Kenneth Smith's spiritual advisor was allowed in the execution chamber with him. At 7:53 p.m., the nitrogen gas began flowing. And that's when the two different versions of what happened began. What happened in the execution chamber that night depends on who you ask. The accounts from witnesses varied significantly, raising questions about whether the execution went as planned or whether something went terribly wrong. According to the Alabama Department of Corrections, Kenneth Smith lost consciousness within minutes and died peacefully. Commissioner John Hamm told reporters the execution went exactly as we expected, and that Smith appeared to lose consciousness in about 2 minutes. But journalists who witnessed the execution told a very different story. Lee Hedgepeth, a reporter for Alabama Public Radio, described Smith writhing and thrashing against the gurney restraints for approximately 2 to 4 minutes. Media witnesses reported seeing Smith gasping for air, his body shaking violently. His spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, said afterward that Smith appeared to be conscious and struggling for much longer than the state claimed, possibly up to 7 or 8 minutes. The Associated Press reporter present wrote that Smith appeared to remain conscious for several minutes and shook and writhed on the gurney, sometimes pulling against the restraints. The execution lasted approximately 22 minutes from the time the nitrogen began flowing until Smith was pronounced dead at 8:25 p.m. The state maintained that what witnesses interpreted as struggling was involuntary movement, the body's autonomic response to oxygen deprivation, similar to agonal breathing. They insisted Smith lost consciousness quickly and felt no pain. But here's the problem: there's no way to prove who's right. No medical monitoring equipment was used. No brain activity measurements. No oxygen saturation readings. Just human observers watching through glass, interpreting what they saw based on their own expectations and biases. Critics pointed out that violent shaking and gasping for air was exactly what experts had warned might happen, that nitrogen hypoxia might not be the peaceful death the state promised. They noted that in industrial accidents involving nitrogen exposure, people typically lose consciousness quickly precisely because they don't realize they're not breathing oxygen. But Smith knew what was happening to him. He knew he was being executed. That awareness, critics argued, could have affected his body's physiological response. In his final statement, Smith said, "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light. Love all of you." His final words to his family were, "I love you." Elizabeth Sennett's son, Charles Sennett Jr., who witnessed the execution, said afterward that justice had been served but that nothing would bring his mother back. He had waited 35 years to see his mother's killer executed. Now, he said, his family could finally have closure. But the question remains, did Kenneth Smith die peacefully in 2 minutes like the state claims? Or did he suffer for 7 or 8 minutes like witnesses described? And if we can't even agree on what happened in that room, how can we claim this execution method is constitutional? Kenneth Eugene Smith's execution on January 25, 2024, marked a significant moment in American criminal justice history. For the first time in over 40 years, a state had introduced a completely new execution method. The last time that happened was in 1982 when Texas conducted the first execution by lethal injection. The use of nitrogen hypoxia immediately sparked intense debate that continues today. Human rights organizations condemn the execution as experimental and potentially torturous. The European Union issued a statement expressing deep regret over the execution and calling for a global moratorium on capital punishment. Medical ethicists warned that Alabama had essentially conducted an experiment on a human subject without the rigorous safety protocols that would be required for any other medical procedure. But supporters of capital punishments saw it differently. They argued that nitrogen hypoxia might actually be more humane than lethal injection, which has been plagued by drug shortages, botched executions, and evidence that the paralytic drugs used can mask extreme pain. Some death penalty advocates hoped nitrogen hypoxia could provide a reliable, constitutional alternative to lethal injection. The question everyone wanted answered was, did Kenneth Smith suffer? The conflicting witness accounts made this impossible to determine with certainty. The state said no. Witnesses described violent physical reactions that suggested otherwise. Without objective medical monitoring, which wasn't part of the protocol, we may never know for sure what Smith experienced in those final minutes. What we do know is this: multiple juries recommended Kenneth Smith be sentenced to life in prison without parole, not death. A judge overrode those recommendations, a practice Alabama later abolished but didn't apply retroactively to Smith's case. He spent 34 years on death row. He survived one failed execution attempt that subjected him to over an hour of painful needle sticks. Then he became the first person executed by an untested method that some medical experts warned could cause unnecessary suffering. Alabama has since executed one more person using nitrogen hypoxia, Alan Miller, in September 2024, 6 years after his original failed execution attempt. Oklahoma and Mississippi have also authorized nitrogen hypoxia as an execution method, though neither has used it yet. Other states are watching Alabama's experience closely. The broader questions raised by Kenneth Smith's case extend far beyond the method of execution. They touch on fundamental issues in American criminal justice. Should judges be able to override jury recommendations in death penalty cases? Is it constitutional to subject someone to multiple execution attempts? Can states experiment with new execution methods on human beings? What level of suffering during an execution crosses the line into cruel and unusual punishment? And perhaps most disturbing, if the state and witnesses can't even agree on what happened during an execution, how can we trust any official account of what happens behind those walls? Kenneth Eugene Smith's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about capital punishment in America. The crime he committed was horrific. Elizabeth Sennett was brutally murdered in her own home for $3,000. Her family endured unimaginable pain, losing both parents within days in the worst possible circumstances. The desire for justice in such a case is completely understandable. But the path from that crime in 1988 to the execution in 2024 raises profound questions about how we administer the death penalty. 2 juries recommended life imprisonment for Smith. A judge overrode both recommendations. The practice that allowed that override was later deemed problematic enough that Alabama abolished it, but not for people already sentenced under it. Smith spent more than 3 decades on death row, costing taxpayers significantly more than life imprisonment would have. The state attempted to execute him once and failed, subjecting him to hours of pain. Then it tried again using a method never before tested on a human being, with results that witnesses couldn't even agree on. 23 states have abolished the death penalty entirely. Even in states that retain it, executions are becoming increasingly rare. In 2024, only a handful of states carried out executions. The trend is clearly moving away from capital punishment, not because of sympathy for killers, but because of growing recognition that the system is flawed, expensive, and prone to error. The question isn't whether Kenneth Smith was guilty. He admitted his role in Elizabeth Sennett's murder. The question is whether executing him 35 years later, using an untested experimental method after one failed attempt, despite jury recommendations for life, serves any meaningful purpose beyond revenge. Elizabeth Sennett's family deserved justice. They deserved to feel safe knowing her killer couldn't harm anyone else. Life without parole would have accomplished that. Instead, they waited 35 years while Kenneth Smith's case wound through the courts, reliving their trauma with each appeal and hearing, until finally witnessing an execution that has sparked international condemnation and ethical debates that will continue for years. There are no easy answers here. Reasonable people disagree about capital punishment. But Kenneth Smith's case illustrates why even many death penalty supporters are reconsidering their position. When the system is this complicated, this expensive, this prone to problems, and this controversial, we have to ask, is this really justice? Kenneth Eugene Smith was executed on January 25, 2024, at age 58. He had spent more than half his life on death row for a murder committed when he was 22 years old. Elizabeth Sennett has been gone for 37 years now. Her family carries her memory and the scars of how she died. Charles Sennett Jr. has spoken about the long journey towards something resembling closure, though he's acknowledged that nothing can truly bring closure when you lose your mother to murder and your father to suicide. Alan Miller, whose botched execution attempt in September 2022 preceded Smith's, was successfully executed by nitrogen hypoxia on September 26, 2024. His execution reportedly followed a similar pattern. Witnesses described gasping and shaking, while the state maintained he lost consciousness quickly. The debate over nitrogen hypoxia continues. Medical experts remain divided. Some states are considering adopting it. Others are moving away from capital punishment altogether. The United Nations and various human rights organizations continue to call for a moratorium on all executions worldwide. Kenneth Smith's spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, has become an outspoken critic of nitrogen hypoxia execution. He's testified before legislatures and continues to speak about what he witnessed that night. Alabama prison officials maintain their execution protocol is sound and constitutional. This case has changed capital punishment in America. Whether that change leads toward or away from the death penalty remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. Kenneth Smith's name will be remembered in criminal justice history as the first person executed by nitrogen hypoxia, a distinction he never wanted and actively fought against until his final breath. So here's where we are. The state says Kenneth Smith died peacefully. Witnesses say he suffered. 2 juries said don't execute him. 2 judges said execute him anyway. Alabama banned the practice that sentenced him to death, but kept him on death row. He survived 1 execution attempt, then became the test subject for another. And through it all, Elizabeth Sennett's family waited 35 years for justice, only to witness an execution that's now the subject of international human rights concerns. The question we're left with is this. In a system where judges override juries, where execution attempts fail, where they experiment with new methods on human beings, and where officials can't even agree on what happened in the execution chamber, can we trust this system with the power to kill? I don't have the answer to that. But I think it's a question every American needs to wrestle with. Because this isn't just about Kenneth Smith. It's about what kind of justice system we want. It's about whether we're okay with executing people under these circumstances. It's about whether the death penalty, as we currently administer it, reflects our values or betrays them. This channel examines the cases that reveal hard truths about our criminal justice system, the decisions that haunt us, the policies that backfire, and the human beings caught in the machinery of justice. These aren't easy stories, but they're important ones. If you want to see more documentary deep dives that don't shy away from complexity, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Next week, I'm covering another execution case that changed American law forever, and it might make you rethink everything you thought you knew about capital punishment. What's your perspective on nitrogen hypoxia execution? Do you think Kenneth Smith's case demonstrates a constitutional alternative to lethal injection, or does it represent cruel experimentation? Do you think the jury override should have kept him off death row? Let me know in the comments below. This is a conversation worth having. Thanks for watching. And remember, Justice should make us better, not more brutal.